Good morning. I think we have just waiting for a few more people to join. Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Smith, and I am a Senior Research Fellow in Business and Human Rights at BIICL. And I just want to start by thanking everyone for joining us today, audience members, as well as speakers, as well as chairs, and also for your patience and flexibility with the change of date, which we had to do at a short notice due to the public holiday that was announced in the UK on the 19th of September, which was the original date that this conference was about to take place, but it was declared a holiday for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. So thank you so much for everyone for making themselves available on this day. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I just want to, before we start, also say thank you so much for the team at BIICL, especially Liam, for helping with the organization of this conference and also the postponement. At BIICL, we have undertaken research on human rights due diligence for a few years now, both in the context of the regulatory developments around mandatory human rights due diligence and on the human rights due diligence practices of companies. In all these conversations, price is almost never expressly mentioned as a step in human rights due diligence, but a key underlying factor in the problem identification. For example, our research has shown that codes of conduct and contractual clauses are the most frequently used actions for human rights due diligence. And the European Commission's draft directive on corporate sustainability due diligence similarly relies heavily on contractual assurances being put in place. In other words, the supplier has to assure the buyer that it will comply with human rights standards without there being any express legal requirement for these contracts to contain prices or purchasing practices by the buyer that enable the supplier to meet these standards. And research, including by the ILO and the ethical training initiatives, have shown that the same contracts that impose human rights codes of conduct on suppliers often do not contain a price at all. And where they do, this price is sometimes only covers 80% of the supplier's production costs. Now, if you look at what a contract of sale in its very essence is, the exchange of one thing for another, the buyer pays a price and the supplier delivers a product or service, these traditional contracts are structured in such a way that they place all the risks and obligations on the supplier, not only for the product delivery, but also for the compliance with human rights, whilst not buying the buyer to even the most basic contractual obligation, the price it commits to paying, as agreed by the supplier. Our research has also shown that in practice, the reason for this is that often the human rights codes of conduct are put in place by an entirely different team within the company than the one which negotiates or determines the price. And yet, despite having signed the most sophisticated of contractual assurances, quote unquote, a supplier will struggle to ensure that human rights are adhered to or cascaded if the price it receives does not even cover its production costs, which includes labor and therefore minimum wage, and overheads for safe working conditions, etc. So it is clear that we cannot divorce price and wages from human rights due diligence in reality. And we also have to move away from the idea that this is an example of companies throwing money at a problem that is out there in the world, because this is a problem that in many cases would not have existed had it not been for the low price in the first place. As we will hear today, human rights issues in supply chains are frequently directly created by this price imbalance problem in the context of the globalization of supply chains and the fragmentation of responsibility and support. Human Rights Watch describes this with the phrase that is also the title of its 2019 report, paying for a bus ticket and expecting to fly. And yes, these conversations about human rights due diligence and mandatory human rights due diligence hardly ever mention price expressly. Sometimes they do mention purchasing practices more generally, but we also know that it's not a quick fix to simply mention pricing as part of a human rights due diligence requirement or commitment without building up the structures and knowledge that enable this to be embedded in realistic outcomes. Most of the successful examples of good practice that we will also hear about today are those that create more balanced business relationships, that ensure that rights holders and workers have power and equality to negotiate and enforce their rights. So this is why we are having this conversation today, to expressly highlight the links between price, remuneration, and human rights diligence, and to think about how these issues can be more effectively integrated, also with reference to some of the very helpful examples that already exist. So with that, I am very, very happy with all our excellent speakers and chairs, and thank you so much today. And I wanted to hand over now to Hannah Edmonds-Kammerer, who will be chairing the first panel. Thank you so much, Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. As Lisa said, my name is Hannah Edmonds-Kammerer. I'm a lawyer at Covington and Burling, and I've been advising corporates on business and human rights for a number of years. As the least interesting person on this panel, I hope to speak as little as possible, so I'll shortly introduce your fantastic panelists for this morning, who I know are going to provide us with some great insight into this area. Just quickly following on from Lisa's comment, she's painted a good picture of why it is that we're tackling this subject. But just to reiterate, remuneration of workers is something that's received some attention as corporates and regulators have begun to focus more and more on human rights due diligence in global value chains, particularly as the world has kind of honed in on risks surrounding modern slavery and forced labour. So we'll often see, for example, provisions surrounding fair wages incorporated into corporate codes of conduct. But something that's perhaps discussed less is how broader conventional pricing and purchasing practices might impact on human rights. So in this first panel, we're going to paint a picture of how remuneration and pricing within global value chains might be linked to human rights harms. We're going to hear plenty of practical examples of the links across a variety of sectors, and we'll hopefully then be able to draw out what risks corporates should be considering as they continue to bolster their human rights due diligence programs. So without further ado, I'll introduce your panelists so that we can dive straight into the topic. I'm going to keep this short and just tell you their current affiliations. This, of course, by no means does justice to their breadth of experience with a range of stakeholders and sectors. So please do have a look at their full bios, and I believe that's going to be posted into the chat. So welcome to the panelists. This morning we have Jason Judd, who's Executive Director of the Cornell University New Conversations Project. We have Anne van Lakerveld, who works for Fairwear Foundation, a multi-stakeholder initiative focusing on human rights in the garment industry. Patricia Carrier is Business Engagement Lead at the Coalition to End Forced Labour in the Uyghur region, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is a region that's been subject to intense scrutiny by a variety of stakeholders in recent years. Lillian Maynor is the Social Compliance and Risk Manager for Fair Trade Africa, with a particular focus on the agricultural sector. And Mustafa Kadri is Founder and Executive Director of Equidem Research and Consulting, specialising in human rights and labour rights investigations. So I've got a number of questions to put to the panelists. I'm sure other attendees today will have other questions, and please do feel free to enter them into the chat function or hold on to them, and we'll try and leave some time at the end of the session to cover them. So Jason, kicking us off today, you've undertaken important research that shows the relationship between price, wages, human rights and working conditions. So to help frame our discussion, could you share some of your findings and analysis with us?
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Hi, everybody. I wish there was more research connecting these three things: due diligence, price, and pay. But I'll lay out for you what at Cornell we've learned about them and the connections between them in our work. And I've got a few slides. I'll show you some data so that we can maybe argue about what it means and how they interact. Let me share my screen. How's that? Good. Okay. So first on due diligence at our center at Cornell, now called the Global Labor Institute, we look closely at private regulation, the regulation of global labor practices by in apparel brands and retailers, for example. And we have looked back over the last 25 years using data from audit firms. This is work done by my partner in the Global Labor Institute, Sarosh Kuravela, from 40,000 audits over a 6-7 year period, which includes the Tazreen fire, the Rana Plaza disaster. We see labor violations across these audits. This is across sectors and across countries, going up a little, going down a little, but really going nowhere. And this means that in the aggregate, when you push together all these tens of thousands of audits over time, there's no progress. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that some companies, some brands and retailers, some buyers of food or home goods or apparel aren't doing a good job, aren't paying close attention to what happens to workers in their contract factories. But taken together, this due diligence approach, audit, remediate, reward, and repeat, doesn't improve practices at the factory level. And pay is included in there. We'll break it down a little where we can. One of the big reasons for this is important for a discussion about pay, is that a lot of the data is really bad. Audits can be super cheap, and they can be in-depth and relatively expensive, and you get what you pay for. An apparel buyer who pays $600 or $700 for an audit in Cambodia or Bangladesh or Ethiopia or China is going to get what they're paying for, unreliable findings. And the data, that same data set, 40,000 audits over that 5-6 year period, indicated that half of all the audits conducted in China by this firm, a reputable firm, had unreliable data in it. That is, that the findings couldn't be relied upon. So 50% plus in China and India. China is where most of those audits were conducted. So even for someone like me who's worked in and around the apparel industry and global production for 20 plus years now, I was surprised by that figure. So there's lots of bad data, and that's important for our discussion of due diligence. And here's the second point. A, there's lots of bad data. B, wages are a secret. Most audits just ask whether, or answer this question: are workers being paid in accord with the law? So is the minimum wage paid at the factory level? Yes or no? And it's been a real struggle to get a struggle by researchers, by campaigners, by investors, by regulators to get meaningful wage data out of factories and out of the brands and retailers that buy from them. So instead of just is the factory in compliance with the legal minimum wage, we want to know what workers are actually paid, and there's a globally accepted formula for this, but very little data to tell us what workers are getting paid. There are some exceptions. Fairware has done some work on this, the Fair Labor Association in Washington, and the methodology for figuring out A, what workers are getting paid, not complicated, and B, what constitutes a living wage or fair compensation. The science of that has gotten a lot better in the last few years, and there is some data available like the one I'm showing you now, which I think is Mexico. This is from a Fair Labor Association report of a few years ago, showing what workers earn, what their base pay is, what bonuses are available to them. Overtime is excluded, and then it's marked against various living wage indicators. Those are those horizontal lines. So unfortunately, there's very little data like this available publicly, and there's a big argument about whether or not that's appropriate. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll leave it to those of you who are to argue about this. But the argument against disclosure of wages is that it's too close to price, and that disclosure of price would be anti-competitive. Now that I understand, but in apparel, for example, wages are about half of total price, of what we call FOB. and that disclosure of actual earnings would indicate price, and that would be inappropriate. But at the Fair Labor Association, this graph comes from their report. This argument was had, and those who were in favor of disclosure of wages won, and they were able to do it. They are able to disclose wages in a way that doesn't get them crosswise with competition law. So this is the second issue, the second obstacle. Not enough actual wage data available for researchers, regulators, and other interested parties. What is available is what I was describing earlier. Lots and lots of data now on compliance. So it's not a living wage question. It's just a legal compliance question, a minimum wage question. And this graph comes from, or rather also comes from the ILO. It's the Better Factories Cambodia, the Better Work program run by the ILO in Cambodia, 20 years now. And these lines show compliance levels with the various categories that the ILO assesses, measure when they visit apparel factories. And you can see the second line there, that claret-colored line is wages. And it doesn't indicate that wages are high, or that living wages are paid, just that the percentage of factories that are meeting the Cambodian legal requirement is somewhere in the neighborhood of, or was in the neighborhood in 2010, 2011, in the 94-95% range. Not bad for a place that's had chronic wage violations, Cambodia. But no indication of whether or not those wages are getting workers close to a living wage. And for that, we turn to a different piece of research. This also conducted by the ILO, but another arm of the ILO. In 2012, 2013, an ILO wages specialist conducted a one-off analysis of productivity and wages changes over time in the Cambodian apparel sector. That graph on the right shows productivity, and you can see in the, what is that, a 15-year period, impressive growth in terms of productivity in the Cambodian apparel sector. And that should, all other things being equal, drive up wages. Wages and productivity should be connected. As productivity climbs, labor share should climb with it. But if you look at the graph on the left, you can see that the opposite was happening. That blue line is nominal wages, nominal minimum wages in the Cambodian apparel sector over that same period. But the red line is showing real wages, that is inflation-adjusted wages. And you can see there that from 2000 through to 2013, real wages, or the real value of the legal minimum wage, was falling over time. So workers who had been in the industry for a dozen years had actually seen the value of their minimum wage falling over time. And that's devastating in a low-wage industry. So the result of this was street protests, an ever larger number of strikes, and eventually a protest, a massive protest in one of the apparel factory neighborhoods in Cambodia. The protests grew to hundreds of thousands. It was the equivalent of an industry-wide strike, and the government called out paratroopers who shot and killed 5 wage protesters. I'm telling this story because it's important for an understanding of wages and how they're measured and what's disclosed. But I'm also telling it because I was there yesterday. I'm in Dhaka today. I was in Phnom Penh yesterday, and we were conducting research for a new paper. This picture is a little incongruous. The picture of the mall is where that wage protest, shown here, took place 8 years ago now. And I haven't figured out what the metaphor is, but the presence of this slick new mall where the wage protesters were shot and killed 8 years ago tells us something important about the apparel industry. What am I up to now? The third or fourth problem that we have is that even where in apparel, brands and retailers are interested in wages, they're collecting factory level data on actual earnings, they're plotting them against living wage estimates, and determining that some number of their contract factories are not making progress towards a living wage or are nowhere near it. It might not matter. It likely doesn't matter for most of those brands because the staff who are conducting the research or worrying about living wages are not in charge of sourcing decisions. And again, this doesn't describe all retailers and brands in apparel. Some of them closely integrate their human rights or sustainability teams with their sourcing teams. But in a lot of firms, I would say the vast majority of firms, there's really no connection between, or no meaningful connection between sourcing and the sustainability analyses that the company conducts. And this piece of research, this graph, shows you what I mean. The research was conducted by a couple of colleagues of ours in our project at Cornell, and they were looking at labor violations in contract factories for a major North American outdoor goods retailer. They were looking at labor violations and orders, and you would expect in a brand, in a firm where there's a close relationship between sourcing decisions and factory level sustainability or good labor practices, you would expect to see that rising violations would lead to a decline in orders, and the opposite. Improving labor practices would lead to an increase in orders. And what you see in this graph is a mess. You see orders going up as violations climb, and this is adjusted for seasonal lags, etc. And this indicates, and we see this in lots of firms, that there really is no meaningful relationship between the decisions that the sourcing team makes about where to buy and how much to buy, and the quality of labor practices there. So that's yet another barrier for us as we try to connect these three things: due diligence, price, and pay. Last but one obstacle for us is that brands retailers are focused on inputs. They're not tracking labor outcomes at the factory level, or they're not analyzing them and acting on them. They're obsessed with the inputs, and this is the sort of thing that goes into a sustainability report or an annual report from a brand. This is from a major European sports brand. I'm not picking on them, I'm just showing that in their annual report, the sorts of things you can glean, the sort of data that you can scrape from this is not very useful. It's the number of training sessions, for example, conducted by this brand with their suppliers, a classic input measure, not an outcome measure. Here's some data on their factory level findings, but you can see them grouped in slightly hard to follow ways, and what you would want or expect from a brand that's dedicated to disclosure and progress on labor practices is a much clearer explanation of what's happening at the factory level. So the quality of reporting, or the focus of the reporting from brands leaves a lot to be desired, and it leads to problems like this, Boohoo, which is maybe the poster child for the relationship between due diligence, wages, and price, was able to score big points in these sustainability measures, and this is due in large part, maybe exclusively, because they're focused on inputs and not outcomes. So this is yet another obstacle, the type of reporting that the industry, that buyers and retailers are committed to, and this is an obstacle to their regulators, and an obstacle to investors who would like to know how deep the commitment to sustainability goes. Okay. Last slide, and then I'll stop. If we were going to make a switch from inputs to outcomes on issues like wages, then we would have to be a lot, we regulators, researchers, investors, brands and retailers themselves would have to be a lot more hard-nosed about what data they're requesting from the factory level, and then organizing and disclosing at the brand or buyer level. So instead of focusing on inputs from the past year, we would instead ask for actionable, useful, hard data on issues like average monthly turnover. That's a close indicator of what's happening at the factory level. Not just that turnover is not just a function of wages, though that's far and away the most important thing for workers. It's also a function of the environment in the factory and the types of labor practices. So that would be one hard measure. A second would be hours monthly, and then a third would be actual monthly earnings for workers in those factories. And then you'd look at those over time, and an investor or a regulator would be able to determine over time whether or not a brand or retailer was picking the right factories, rewarding factories that are improving labor practices, and generally raising the bar. But I think we've got a long way to go to get to this sort of regime, though there's a shot at it in the European Union, where they're discussing now what sort of hard measures of human rights due diligence are appropriate. Okay, Hannah, sorry that was a little long, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. Certainly you've raised lots more questions and kind of illustrated for us the complexities in kind of linking these issues. We'll come back and I'll follow up with some questions about some of the things you've picked up on. Just one point, I mean, one of the things that we see a lot in practice is this tension between kind of compliance with national laws versus what international kind of labour standards say about how workers should be treated and what they should be paid, and that's something that I know is very challenging for corporates. So it's really interesting to hear you draw that out in your study. So let's move on and hear some thoughts from Anne. So Anne, with Fairwear, you work with brands in the garment sector to readdress power imbalances. Could you explain a bit more about how that works and what pricing looks like in the garment sector?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. Also, thank you, Jason, for sharing these insights again, I'd say. Yeah, so with Fairwear, we focus on improving labor conditions in garment factories. We work with around 90 member companies, and these member companies commit to a code of labor practices, including payment of living wage. And for over 20 years, we've been working on creating change when it comes to wages. And based on all of these years of experience, we realized that we're facing a number of realities in the garment industry. There's a few obvious ones: the fact that human rights there's a lack of global human rights protection, that in many garment industry we see very limited or underdeveloped social dialogue, which of course harms workers' ability to negotiate for a living wage. But if we look at the garment industry, I think and also linking the information that Jason just shared to how you can actually address higher wages linked to prices, is the fact that there's high competition between brands, between factories, but also between countries. So the legal minimum wage is really used as a means to maintain competitive advantage over other countries. We see that there's thousands of garment brands and thousands of garment factories, and there's hardly any one-to-one connection. One factory will produce for over 20 customers, and one brand will source from at least 20 factories, and as such, responsibility becomes very diffuse. And then what's also very prominent in the garment industry is that brands outsource production. And as such, brands do not pay the wages of these workers. They pay prices that enable the employers of the workers to pay a certain wage. And as such, if we're talking wages, but especially related to due diligence and related to prices, I think it's important to also make sure we get clarity on the different responsibilities. And as such, what we see right now in many codes of conduct and also as a determining factor in a lot of audit schemes is that responsibility for human rights compliance is put on the shoulders of producers, while actually the financial gains are mostly with the garment brands, which creates, of course, a imbalance. And as long as brands are not willing to also support financially, but also in their own practices, the possibility for human rights compliance, I don't think we'll see any other figures coming out of these audits than the ones that Jason just showed. So what we're focusing on with our member brands is, on the one hand, ensuring brands know the link between the prices they pay to the factories and the wages workers get in the factories. Really have them understand how they can influence wages, and then also ensure they free up budget and start to contribute. So really putting money where their mouth is. And on the other hand, focus on more fact-based costing on the supplier side. Because what we see right now is that a lot of the price negotiation is a bit of a black box. You shake, a figure comes out, and either it's accepted or not. And we see a lot of top-down pricing. So garment brands will start with their retail price, then deduct all their internal costs, and then come up with a figure that's actually not based on all the production costs. So when factories feel they are able to really break down costs and also isolate the labor cost component in order to link this labor cost component to the current wage level, but well, in the case of our brands also, for example, living wage estimate. That way you could really steer the conversation. And the way we do this is through labor minute costing, which looks at the cost for 1 minute of labor in a specific factory, which is then multiplied by the number of minutes that's needed for each of the customers. And as such, there's sort of an objective value, the labor minute value, which is factory specific, which is put on specific orders, and because of the divide, there's also not so much, or it limits the, what's the word? There's no problems in terms of competition law. So when it comes to garment prices, the link between prices and wages is actually not so clear than, for example, if you look at bananas, because each order is different and each number of minutes for the order is different. And we've also had this approach analyzed against EU competition law to really see that this is a way for our members to cooperate in increasing leverage in order to really make a change. And this is a process that we also monitor with our brands. We do an annual performance check where we indeed look at the extent to which our member brands know the link between prices and wages, whether they've come up with a financing strategy, and also whether they've actually paid higher prices. And it's, yeah, we do see on that level, so that's still input, we see changes, but then it also becomes there's a shift in responsibility, and as an employer to raise wages, it's something that you cannot reverse. So you really need to have the financial backing to make a commitment to higher wages. So this is something we would see requires a bit more time in order for things to for us to also see more impact on the ground.
Thank you, Anne. That's very helpful. Particularly, I think you know, again, adding a layer of complexity, particularly in the garment industry, when you're thinking about how many different products there are and length of production time. I think this is something that brands are no doubt kind of grappling with internally. Is you know, looking at those price structures through a human rights due diligence lens. So thank you for that. Patricia, you've also been focusing on the links between pricing and human rights, particularly about how price can lead to destitution. Could you speak to us about some examples of this?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. So I'm currently with the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, as you mentioned, but my background has very much been in modern slavery previously, specifically looking at the UK Modern Slavery Act and looking at how companies were reporting under that legislation or failing to disclose really some key information. And so just in terms of linking price to destitution, for example, I think it is useful to use that modern slavery framing where we talk about labor exploitation is occurring on a spectrum. And that covers all sorts of labor abuse, including, lack of payment of even minimum wage, restrictions to freedom of association, which might allow you to advocate for yourself to get higher wages, forced overtime, gender-based violence, et cetera, all the way through to forced labor at the other end of that spectrum, if you will. And I think it's important to, realize that abuses don't occur in isolation, but rather more on a continuum where, your circumstances might change and you might find yourself in a more precarious or vulnerable situation based on any number of socioeconomic factors, such as immigration status, employment status, gender, et cetera. So really, a person can move between these different forms of exploitation and severity. And I think the pandemic, for example, really illustrated how easily this can happen, especially in the garment sector. So, disruptions to supply chains obviously led to order cancellations or delays. And this meant that a lot of people didn't receive their wages and were really faced with destitution. And of course, women and migrant workers were disproportionately affected. And so this caused huge numbers of workers to sort of slide down that spectrum toward modern slavery. These were already people that were being exploited, but really forced down to even more precarious situations. And this has been illustrated by the new Global Slavery Index that just came out about 3 weeks ago, which has found that there are 28 million people in forced labor. This is up from 25 million just over the past 5 years. And 86% of those workers are in the private sector. So we're talking about supply chain workers. And the Global Slavery Index found that, this was in due in part to disruptions to income because a lot of workers were then in large debts and found themselves in debt bondage. So linking this back to business, we really do have to consider how business models can be and are the drivers of exploitation. And this includes, practices related to price. We've already heard about these aggressive pricing negotiations that happen by brands at the top of supply chains that hold all the power, and they are paying below the cost of production. And therefore, how are you meant to pay your workers a living wage, much less, or a minimum wage, much less a living wage, if you're not even covering those basic costs? And we also heard about countries trying to use legal minimum wages to stay competitive. But there is, plenty of anecdotal evidence, that shows how brands, even where there is perhaps an increase in a minimum wage in a country, they stick to their price. So, they're not accommodating or considering those wage adjustments in their costings. So we really have these drivers at the very top of supply chains that are, directly lead to low wages. And when you have a pandemic, of course, you have a system that's already based on an inability to accrue any savings or to make ends meet. And so then when a pandemic hits, you just have these people that are, again, facing destitution. And I think it's also really important to realize how price, which leads to low wages, can have an impact beyond the financial or economic and beyond the workplace. So there was a report done by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, and Society for Labor and Development that found links to gender-based violence and harassment. They linked this directly back to brands' purchasing practices during the pandemic. And a lot of women that were interviewed for this report said that, their inability to pay rent based on loss of wages or decrease in wages led to increased gender-based violence and harassment by their landlords. So they faced sexual harassment and also, of course, threats of eviction. A lot of these women also said that there was a rise in domestic violence at home by their husbands. So we're talking about verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. And these women linked this rise in domestic violence directly back to their job losses and wage cuts. So it really is, I think, important to realize that this is a systemic problem that will lead to harmful impacts, not just in the workplace, but also at home. And in my own experience in working with the Modern Slavery Act, one of the main sort of arguments against this type of legislation, in addition to the fact that it was merely a reporting requirement, it didn't require any type of due diligence on the part of companies, is that it was really asking companies to identify instances of modern slavery and to remediate those. And really that's asking companies to treat the symptom or a symptom of a much bigger systemic problem. And so, remediating an instance of modern slavery is really like putting a plaster on a much bigger systemic problem. And that's why I think if done right, human rights due diligence would obligate companies to look at, going back to the idea of a spectrum, looking at remediating and mitigating all of those labor rights abuse in order to prevent the most severe types of exploitation. So yeah, I mean, that's, I think, how we look at it in the modern slavery space, looking at the decisions that are made at the very top of supply chains where all the power sits, and how this can lead to, a sort of snowballing of circumstances that lead workers to, these very, very precarious situations.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Patricia. I think particularly the point you made there about the links not only between kind of workplace human rights issues, but the knock-on effect and the kind of human rights that can be affected. That's perhaps something that corporates can take on board and be looking kind of outside just the workplace and look at those connected human rights, and also kind of planning ahead to make sure that in the event that labour becomes more precarious, that there are safeguards in place, building that into kind of human rights due diligence frameworks. So thanks for those thoughts. Lillian, with Fair Trade Africa, you work in the agricultural context. From your practical perspective, could you tell us what the situation is like for farmers and workers in the agricultural sector, and then also what you see stakeholders can do to prepare for avoiding these kind of scenarios in the event of another pandemic or social crisis?
Thank you very much, Hannah. As you have mentioned, I'm representing the producer perspective, and in this case, we are talking about small-scale agricultural farmers and workers, both in the small-scale cooperative setups and also in plantations. The challenge that we have had, in the way the conventional market has been set up, is that producers virtually have no control over the setting of prices, as it has been mentioned by those who have spoken before. So if you find that there are challenges when it comes to, they have little to no negotiating power when it comes to pricing. They are left to the goodwill of the commercial partners, and sometimes to the implementation of policies at national level. And we know that the implementation of these policies is often very weak. And this came out strongly during the COVID-19 pandemic. As Patricia has mentioned, the effects were devastating. In plantations, we had workers that had to be laid off. And of course, the situations were not pleasant, even in their communities and in their households. Some producer organizations that are fair trade certified try to come up with solutions on how some workers can work at intervals to ensure that as many of them are earning, even if not what they were used to earning, they could earn something so as to ensure they're earning something basic to feed their children and all that. But it was quite difficult, and this pandemic exposed, or I would say it took us back looking at some of the milestones that have been made in addressing the issues of child labor, the issues of forced labor, and even gender-based violence. I think the pandemic really took us back. And what we as a producer network have done to try and address some of these challenges that are present in the conventional market, especially when it comes to pricing, is that Fairtrade has set a minimum price. A minimum price is the floor price below which trader who is purchasing on Fairtrade terms cannot buy below that amount. And the minimum price usually calculates, considers the cost of sustainable production of that commodity, and adds an amount on top so as to ensure that this producer then is able to earn a livelihood and to reinvest in their production. In addition to the Fairtrade minimum price, we have what we call the Fairtrade premium. And this is an amount that is paid on top of the Fairtrade price or the market price, because the producer usually gets whichever is higher between the minimum price and the market price. So on top of that, they receive the Fairtrade premium funds, which they themselves make a decision on how to invest. They can choose to invest, to reinvest in the production. They can invest in their community development activities, things like schooling or other projects that are essential to their communities. They can reinvest in climate-related aspects of their businesses and production. Then on top of that, we have what we call organic differential. This applies to commodities that are Fairtrade certified, and they are grown in organic ways. And there's also differentials for specific products such as cocoa. We have the cocoa minimum differential. So this minimum prices and the Fairtrade premium have been set to cushion the farmers, essentially the producers, from the market volatility that is quite common in the conventional markets. And we have seen positive effects of some of these interventions, because with things like the Fairtrade Premium Fund, we have seen producers being able to somewhat earn a dignified livelihood and to be able to take their children to school. They are able to earn an amount which helps them to continue producing that commodity and to be able to meet their basic needs. And this is in line with our vision as Fairtrade, because we aspire to have a world in which producers can earn secure and sustainable livelihoods, fulfill their potential, and decide on their future. And that bit for sustainable livelihood, something else that is quite essential is the issue of having contracts. which are assurances for producers. They are assured that they have markets. So this would enable them to even plan their production because they have ready markets. And this is quite important for the producers that are fair trade certified. Beyond the aspect of pricing, we have also had interventions that are related to wages. In the fair trade standards, we have the living wage benchmarks. These are calculations that are pegged on the World Bank poverty rates and also the purchasing power parity, and they are very specific for various countries. And we are working with this through the Global Living Wage Coalition as co-founders of the Global Living Wage Coalition. And this living wage benchmarks are helping us in what we are calling our living wage aspirations. We aspire to get to the point where a worker in a flower farm or a worker in a banana plantation can be able to earn decent amounts of income for them to be able to meet their needs and those of their children, and also for farmers to be able to meet their needs and to even pay decent wages to the workers that they have employed. So we have had various pilots in the banana sector and in the flower sector, so as to see how we can reach to the implementation of living wage. And even as we aspire towards that, something that we have introduced with this fair trade premium is the cash disbursement of fair trade premium. Yes, I have mentioned that premiums are often used to reinvest in businesses and to implement projects in the community, but now we are looking at fair trade premiums as a tool that can boost the incomes that workers are earning, because we acknowledge that most businesses have not gotten to the point where they can be able to pay a living wage to their workers. It has to be sustainable. So even as we aspire to get there with all the producers, how can fair trade premium be used to boost the incomes that the workers are already earning? So we acknowledge, national level minimum wages. Now we have the floor wages, and we aspire to get to the living wages for fair trade certified producers.
Thanks, Lillian. It's very helpful. I think these tools that Fair Trade Africa and others are developing, looking at kind of living wage benchmarks, are going to be so helpful in the coming years as corporates are looking at these kind of pricing structures through a human rights due diligence lens. And something I'm hearing from you and from panelists before is, the importance of companies as they're looking at pricing structures, looking at it from a bottom up rather than a top down approach. So really, taking into account cost of living for workers and what that, how to address that in pricing structures. So thank you for that. Mustafa, with Equidem, you carry out investigations on worker and working conditions in various sectors across the world, including in the Middle East and South Asia. Could you elaborate a bit about what you've seen in relation to links between pricing, remuneration, and human rights?
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Hannah, for having me. And it's been really great to learn a lot from the other speakers, and what others have been saying really resonates with what I and my colleagues have been working on. So as you say, just as a very quick introduction, my organization is a human rights consultancy, and we work in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, though typically the companies we either work for or that we're monitoring for others, they're based in Europe or North America, not always. So there's invariably a link, to the global north, even though our focus is the global south. The other thing that's a bit unique with us is our team actually includes rights holders in it. So for example, in places like Malaysia, South Africa, in the Arab Gulf states, our teams are themselves workers. So this gives them a very unique understanding of the situations that workers are facing. And they're typically not, consultants or contractors, there are staff. So it's very much about this idea of building ownership and expertise amongst rights holders themselves, to have a good evidence base to then think about what the solutions are. So in terms of pricing and remuneration, again, like I said, what others said really resonates with some of the work that we're doing and have done. I wanted to sort of focus on a few kind of key areas that might be useful for discussion. The first one is around this idea that, it's mentioned by others as well, that pricing does not really reflect the actual costs of labor plus the other costs related to protection measures. And, there's lots of reasons for that. Obviously, corporations are about the bottom dollar, but there's also the fact that as a structure, the corporation is designed for liability minimization. It's about externalizing as much as possible to keep your legal footprint as lean as possible in general. So in the process of dealing with human rights due diligence, you're almost dealing with the opposite situation, where even when you have good corporate actors, and we always work with people that we feel in the business community are genuinely trying to address a human rights issue. And so this is a huge challenge. It's not to make any excuses for particularly large corporations, but if you're designed to externalize, and then you're recognizing that looking at the international human rights standards on business and human rights, you think of the Ruggie principles and the UNGPs, it's about going beyond just your contractual relationships, and where, for example, your compliance lawyers may say that you don't have any direct legal liability, but it's actually a really challenging structurally thing for them to deal with. Having said that, this is typically compounded by other factors, which actually those factors are no excuse for. So by that, what I mean is a very common thing that we see, across sectors and geographies. So like I said, we work in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, working in a range of different sectors. We will typically be brought in by someone at near the top of the supply chain or the contractual chains, well after the bidding and the tendering process, where human rights due diligence has not actually been part of the business plan. It hasn't been part of the budgeting as well. It's that only latterly, after commencing the project, there's a realization that there may be some human rights concerns there. And so they want to then proactively deal with that. And that's typically because of reputation. There may be other reasons too. In some occasions, it is also ethical motivation by the management typically, but usually it's reputational concern. And so what that means is that obviously any time is a good time to seek to address your human rights responsibilities, to commence a human rights due diligence process, but it does make it really difficult. And one way that you see this is not the only way, but is in pricing. So a very common example of that is that, you have a very large project. It could be to do with the garment sector, it could do with logistics, oil and gas, construction, agriculture, many different sectors, where a very large client company at the very top with quite a bit of leverage is now demanding modern slavery due diligence, but the pricing provided down the supply chain hasn't changed. And the way that it's dealt with is to say that, it's your responsibility to respect our human rights policies that say no worker should be charged illegal recruitment fees, there should be no delays in payment, all those sorts of things. And so, we've worked very closely with a range of business actors, big and small, that on a very practical level find this very challenging because, ultimately they're running a business. And so the resourcing required to address the issue, it goes beyond pricing, but obviously pricing is that first sort of hurdle that really often makes it very challenging. And, I have to say often our job is the hard one. It is, confronting or talking to business partners who can be very upset, very hostile to what's being asked of them. And in fact, often it's a conversation around trying to explain what these human rights standards are all about, which, obviously we are human rights experts, but it's very frustrating because it shows that there's an element of externalization of that top tier company's responsibility to not only price in human rights due diligence and human rights responsibilities, but also to educate the supply chain about what their vision is for addressing human rights responsibility. And this happens time and time again. And across sectors, it really strikes me how often this becomes an issue. The other thing that really has come out from our work is that when you're bringing in external experts like myself and my team and others, is typically, and I'm sure this will resonate with many people on the call, that the budgets available for our work are really quite limited and often very, very small. And that obviously is partially around, you know, a challenge many businesses are facing, that those working with businesses are facing. You know, it's obviously now a very challenging time economically, but it also is a very clear way of showing from the management level the level of priority that's being given to addressing human rights. And also this perception that you throw a little bit of money at a problem like human rights to provide some kind of steer or direction, or to at least demonstrate to management or to the shareholders or external parties that you're trying to deal with the human rights issues. And so, you know, if I'm very honest with you, Equidem is the consultancy is a consultancy. We're a company, but we'll often work at cost or below cost because we're dealing with situations where the funding is actually, you know, is barely adequate to deal with the issues that we uncover. I mean, one example I'll give is to do with a major brand had huge concerns with sexual harassment of women who were representatives of their product in shopping centers in a certain emerging country in Asia. And the team that we worked with the big multinational, was really committed, very, you know, knowledgeable about human rights, but the budget available was really laughable. And so obviously, you know, as human rights actors, first and foremost, we felt really obliged to make the best of what we could do with the resources available. But this also has an impact in terms of the effectiveness of how you deal with these issues. And ultimately, you know, it came down to us doing an assessment on the ground, a bottom-up assessment. So having that evidence base and a lot of work around developing due diligence systems and remedy processes. But it ended up being that there's a lot of work that needed to be done that the company has to take forward, has to make those decisions, and no expert can be, you know, it can't be externalized to that expert to deal with those issues. So that was something that came up, but it's a very common issue that we face. The other thing is that separate to the pricing, and that's either to do with things like, you know, is there sufficient funds for workers to be paid within the supply chain or for experts to do their job adequately, is that there is a tendency to be focusing on pricing in, separate to the other considerations that are really critical to dealing with your human rights responsibility. So what I mean by that is that there's often a very linear approach taken to thinking about human rights harm and how to address that. And this goes to the earlier point that I made, that often in particularly large supply chain contexts is the biggest harm may be down your supply chain or in a specific corridor of your value chain where your contractual leverage is very limited. You may not contractually have many links to certain actors who are, for example, most to blame for certain practices. And you have to basically develop a strategy that's not just about budgets and pricing, factors that in and thinks about that, but thinks about more broadly, what is the company or the business stakeholders in the value chain? What is their actual strategy and approach to meeting their human rights responsibilities? And what are the ways to measure that? So for example, to what extent at the highest level in management, in the business structure, is someone going to be held accountable? Is someone going to review the processes in themselves? Ultimately, what is the medium to long-term objective that you're seeking to address in your addressing your human rights responsibilities? Again, one really simple example of that is, rightly, there's a lot of focus with large companies with large supply chains around migrant workers in their workforce and being charged large recruitment fees and how to formulate an adequate amount to repay them. But often that overshadows the deeper issues around a person has been harmed that has huge, significant human impacts, which under national and international law is also part of how we should conceive of remedy and compensation. But those non-financial aspects are not adequately thought about, even though you're talking about businesses that are working in certain labor markets over the long term. You know, you think of countries like Malaysia or South Africa or even the Gulf region, though frankly, practically every labor market in the world. And, you know, there's business to be made there. And in that process, there are human rights concerns to think about. But the pricing aspect means that there is a lack of integrating the strategy beyond just the financial measures of how a company might respond to a certain issue. Now, one final point to say at this point is around the fact that, remuneration is an inaccurate measure of human rights remedy or addressing responsibilities, because whatever human rights due diligence is done has to be integrated into wider efforts of the business community and, of course, wider society. So by that, what I mean is that, we're dealing with typically in human rights, in particularly the most high-profile situations, whether it's Xinjiang in China, forced labor concerns in Malaysia, or, of course, the issues you see in the Arab Gulf region, that these are huge intractable problems and no one really has all the solutions. We know that there are some clear red lines that, the human rights community has been very clear about, that we will not accept business profit making in those contexts. But the problem is we don't have all the solutions. The only way that we can think about addressing those is to work in a multi-stakeholder way. And this is a challenge because particularly when you're dealing with a specific business or even a conglomerate or a business partnership that's dealing with an issue, it's natural to not want to publicize too much about any concerns or real issues that you've identified for very obvious reasons. But I think that that's where there needs to be that multi-stakeholder approach. But critically, and what I've seen from our work is, I feel very strongly it cannot just be an industry-led multi-stakeholder approach, because what you often find in those is, although they're very useful, is that there is a benchmarking of what they see as success that is often very different and typically much lower than the benchmark that will be used by the wider human rights community or rights holders themselves. And so you often have these situations. I've been in many meetings, and I say this with complete respect and no sense of arrogance, no intended arrogance, but where you have certain business representatives touting a solution that they've provided, which may be higher than the low threshold of their industry, but in fact is actually a really poor remedy solution. And if you talk to rights holders, the wider human rights community, they'd say to you very, very easily and very quickly that there are factors that you haven't really thought about. And, one really good example of that is the World Cup in Qatar, where, there has been a lot of effort to try to deal with, forced labor practices in Qatar. There have been some improvements, but they're completely top down in a country which has no civil political freedoms and where trade union rights are completely not only not recognized in the law, but they're criminalized. And there are no efforts to try to actually allow workers to have collective representation in any kind of way. And so, quite frankly, from my research and work that we're publishing in a few weeks' time, actually, it's very clear that in the absence of those things, those kind of top-down approaches don't really deal with your human rights due diligence responsibilities. So you have to have that multi-stakeholder approach, but it has to be one that's not siloed along different types of groups within the wider ecosystem. There has to be a broader conversation because these are challenging issues. And there's, as others have mentioned, there's emerging legislation, exciting, if also disappointing, that mean that clearly expectations are increasing, but it also means there's an opportunity. And the question is, will businesses use that as an opportunity to, again, show that they're complying, they're doing the bare minimum to keep up with that change, or will they show leadership in partnership where possible with the wider human rights community to actually address the human rights issues that either they fall part of or they may even themselves be causing? So I'll leave it there for now, but look forward to further discussion with everyone.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. And again, drawing out some really important thoughts about the need to be thinking about these pricing human rights issues from the outset and not just being responsive to kind of reported issues, and also things like involving worker voices in discussions around remediation. These are all really important points when we're considering remuneration and human rights impact. I'm going to come back round to each of the speakers with another question. As I anticipated, there's so much good content here. I'm not sure there's going to be lots of time at the end for questions, but I think we're allowed to run over a little bit at the end. So I'm keeping an eye on the questions in the chat function as well. So Anne, coming back to you, you mentioned that at Fairware, you've developed some factory tools that allow companies to use fact-based costing. And I wondered if you could just give us a bit more information about how these tools work and how brands can start using them, and also perhaps even, you know, companies outside of the garment sector, could we be using these tools as a template for considering pricing?
Yes, thank you. In our, just to reiterate that in our approach, we continue to stress the different responsibilities of different supply chain actors. And when it comes to wages, the responsibility lies with the employer, and that the employer needs to ensure there's sufficient financial room to increase wages. And this also relates to the communication we have with our brands. If we will not ask our brands to pay living wages because they're not the ones paying the wages. We ask them to ensure that their prices enable employers or enable factories to pay higher wages. And it's this sort of financial chain, so to say, that makes it important to ensure that a brand takes in the or takes responsibility for pricing. And I think several of the speakers have also mentioned, for example, the internal alignment position there, that a CSR person and a purchaser and also a marketing person, they need to be aligned to make sure that the way prices are set are also based on actual costs. And as a factory, factories need to be able to incorporate their actual costs in their prices and not be forced to produce under the actual cost, which is something that Mustafa also mentioned in terms of your own practices. I think the fact that well, so we really try to prevent brands sitting on the chair of the factory, and ask factories about actual costs and not transparent, like complete transparency on their end, because that also reinforces some of the power imbalances, but really fact-based costing and enabling brands to also know how the prices they pay link to wages workers currently get or could get. And so we have some tools and guidances for brands, but then we also developed a tool specifically for factories, which allow them to get a better grip on their wage costs, and also allow them to translate wage costs to specific orders of customers, and then use that information in different varieties of transparency to also to also use that as part of the negotiation. So negotiations can really focus on actual costs and not be just a black box that well, that is shaken and then hopefully gets us somewhere.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Anna. Jason, you've mentioned that there's often a tension or mismatch between the sourcing team within a company and the sustainability or human rights teams. Could you elaborate a bit more on this, and how you think pricing and wages can be more coherently integrated into human rights due diligence processes internally?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a secret. Most this doesn't go for all, but most sustainability and human rights teams are small and underfunded, and they work in the basement. In some firms, they let them out of the basement and they put them together with sourcing people, the people at the business end of the business. But that's still not the norm. I think one of the ways to integrate them is, well, I don't know how you get the C-suite to say these have to be integrated. maybe by demonstrating the mismatch that I was describing, or the research that I shared shows. And once you get that, then you have to get the teams to do very basic things like begin to share data. So I know sustainability human rights teams who ask for POs, ask for orders, ask for sourcing data, and they can't get it inside their own companies. I mean, it won't be shared with them. So they have to overcome that sort of thing and then just begin to integrate data, sourcing data with labor compliance data. Is there a match? Are we rewarding factories that take our purported principles, our labor governance standards seriously? So that's one. Another is pay. People on the sourcing side get paid as they grow the margin. So price discussions usually start from the price in the last order. And in apparel, for example, a brand or retailer might say to a contractor, we paid X for this item last time, and we want to pay X minus 4% the next time. And it, as I think maybe Anna said, it may bear little or no relationship to changes in the contractor's costs. And senior people inside buyers get paid based on their ability to expand the margin, so to push down price. And that's a problem. That's the wrong incentive. This is sort of the larger point. I didn't get to talk about the role of unions, but one of the countervailing powers in this whole scheme is organized workers. And most brands, most buyers, this is true in apparel, but it's also true in other sectors, even where unions are present, buyers and brands don't make it a priority. They don't say to their sourcing team, I want you to wait, or I want you to rate the presence of an independent or bona fide worker organization in your sourcing hunt. So as a result, very few brands outside of places like China and Vietnam, where unions are obligatory, are in factories where workers are organized and can bargain and deal with the problems that we're talking about, wages in particular. And that would, on a sort of factory-wide basis, drive up price in a way that doesn't require each individual brand to come to terms with the supplier about how price is going to accommodate higher wages. The floor is coming up. But having said that, organizing workers at the factory level is a terrible grind. I mentioned Cambodia. I'm in Bangladesh now. These are places where it's enormously difficult for workers to organize. So that's one problem. And buyers know this going in. It's just not freedom of association, the presence of a union. It's not something buyers pay attention to or look for. It's just something that rides eternally in their code of conduct. So that would be one. Choose factories where workers are organized and have the wherewithal to bargain about wages. At Cornell, we did a study. My colleague Sarosh Kuravila did a quantitative analysis of labor compliance rates in factories, and found that where there is a union and a collective bargaining agreement, here without regard for the sort of the quality of the relationship between the union and the management, or the union and the workers, compliance was on average 10% higher. So not 80, but 90% compliance with the standard. And that's a big, that's a big bump. 10%, that's not nothing. And that's attributable to the presence of a union and a collective bargaining agreement. One of the majors, last point. One of the I was in Vietnam before I was in Cambodia, and met with a major global apparel producer, one of the world's best known. They have 15 buyers in Vietnam. Of the 15, only one is putting money into the fair trade top-up scheme that Lillian was describing. Fair trade sets up a program in a factory, and the buyer can contribute 2% of FOB, 2% of the purchase price towards workers. It could be paid to them as a cash bonus, or they could choose to invest it in a project, something that betters their lives, their community. For example, of the 15 brands buying from this major producer, all of them with living wage obligations in their codes, or in the multi-stakeholder schemes that they're part of. Only one took up the offer and is paying that bonus in FOB to contribute to workers' wages. So I think we've got a long way to go.
Thank you, Jason. Shifting gears slightly, Lillian, you mentioned the importance of having contracts as a form of commitment to farmers and workers. We know that the EU proposed directive includes some language around contractual terms and cascading human rights obligations down through your supply chain. But again, that focuses on cascading standards downwards. So I wondered if you could say a little about why you think contracts are important and what kind of commitments you think contracts need to contain in order to contribute to sustainable production.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, indeed, contracts are important for producers because they give an assurance and a sustainability aspect in their production businesses. They are able to anticipate the volumes that are required, and especially for hired labor setups, it helps them to be able to plan and to even know what number of workers are required, and that speaks a lot about then how their wage bill will look like. So we cannot underestimate the value of contracts and agreements in production. And what we have done as Fairtrade is to put this as a requirement even in the trader standard, because in the Fairtrade system, it's not only producers who are Fairtrade certified, even traders are certified to source on Fairtrade terms. So we have put this as a requirement, and this really enables producers to be able to plan and to be assured that they're not just producing and then anticipate and hope for someone to buy, but they are able to even organize themselves as businesses. And really that is the way I see it. It's a way of empowering the producers themselves. We have talked about the power imbalance that is there, but with such agreements, it really dignifies their work, and it shows them as important in this supply chains, and they're able to organize themselves as businesses. In addition to that, I'm just trying to see how valuable it is for the traders to see themselves as parts of the solution to the human rights issues in supply chains. We have said that, and people who have spoken there before have said that much of the burden to respect human rights has been left to the producers. And we have talked about the producers not having the power to influence pricing and all that. But I agree to what a previous speaker has said. I think it's Mustafa who talked about having a multi-stakeholder approach. And in this light, I would want to emphasize on the importance of these companies to take responsibility to contribute to the respect of human rights, where they may be directly having links, and even where they may not be directly having links in the communities of these producers and other such. It would be important that they see themselves as parts of the solution to the respect of human rights at the production level. And it would be important that we also increase advocacy and policy influence to be able to have more producers have a seat at the table in these conversations, if it's in pricing, if it's in setting plans on how to implement human rights due diligence, it is important that producers can also have a seat at the table. So in addition to the question that you asked, those are the 2 points that I also wanted to add on to contribute to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. And just to raise for everyone's attention, I think the panel this afternoon, there's going to be someone speaking about some model clauses that have been developed by the American Bar Association. So this discussion on kind of contract terms will be covered in more detail there as well. I've got a final question for Mustafa and Anna, but I just wanted to give Patricia a heads up about a question in the chat that I was hoping to put to you after these two. So the question is, how do we encourage transparency around outsourcing, given there's evidence that pay rates below tier 1 are even lower? And I think kind of adding to that also, you know, are brands, are companies even aware of what's going on below tier 1? How do we increase transparency there? So I'll give you a few minutes to mull that over. Mustafa, what are some ways in which you see that price and wages could be more effectively integrated within human rights due diligence in practice?
Yeah, and this is a really key question. I mean, in many ways, the way that you deal with that is the same as how you would improve your human rights due diligence monitoring in the first place. You have to find non-linear, multidimensional, as much as possible, bottom-up approaches to actually measure the actual cost of your labor, of your workforce, and of the non-wage related costs as well. So, for example, it actually doesn't take that much work once you know how much is being paid to a certain supplier to calculate how much would workers be paid based, you know, in an absolute maximum amount. You know, you see that with, for example, we did an investigation, as our charity did, sorry, not the consultancy, on the hotel being used by the England football soccer team for the Qatar World Cup. Now, the workers in that hotel are being paid slightly above the minimum wage under Qatar law, but their wages amount to less than about £1 per day in a hotel where hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent to have state-of-the-art, you know, conditions for England football players. Now, you know, it took some doing by us to do that, but in fact, if you look at even information filed with the regulatory authorities, if you are within that business supply chain, in fact, you could find that out. You could find out, even if you don't know exactly how much workers are really being paid, you can calculate very quickly whether the amounts being apportioned for certain contractors or for a certain supplier are actually, you know, sufficient to provide a living wage. So there's some really practical ways in which you can do that. The other thing is, I think, also speaking to rights holder representatives. And I think there was a question in the chat about this as well, that, you know, there's no question there will be challenges. There is no one solution to this, but typically workers are organized even in a very informal way. You have the labor desks of foreign embassies when it comes to migrant workers. There's also trade unions in different parts of the world that will often have their networks there, or they even actually may have their own initiatives that can provide some guidance as to, you know, what is a living wage, what are good ways to do pricing, which would then be a better reflection of your human rights responsibilities. The other thing is also that, you know, just as corporations can be quite fastidious when it comes to, say, in the garment sector, the kinds of dyes that they use in their product, where the cotton is sourced, there are ways that you can actually map out your factories from a labor rights perspective, and then that can also be integrated into the way that you do pricing. So that, for example, in places like Bangladesh or Pakistan, you know, you can look at things like what kind of issues around energy usage are there? Are there routine blackouts? What kind of populations live around those areas? That sounds all quite complicated, but there actually is a real wealth of information already available. There are experts out there that track that kind of information. And in fact, if you have that information to hand, you can actually work out very quickly the types of risks that are likely to occur in that sort of a context, you know. So then you have to sort of be reaching out to different stakeholders that are monitoring that situation, and then based on that, work out what would be, you think, an adequate pricing. Because as others have said before me, responsibility should lie on all sides, but particularly the one with the greatest purchasing power generally has the greatest leverage. And when they set the price, that cascades all the way down the chain. And when they then decide to commit to human rights due diligence or to certain standards of human rights, talk about this at conferences, that's great, but often can lead to a lot of pressure, ironically, in a negative way down the chain. I mean, one really great example of this, and I'm very happy to mention it. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but, you know, you always hear, for example, Apple, you know, the Apple Incorporated will talk about that they will ensure that no worker should be charged illegal fees for their job. If they find out about this, this needs to be remediated. Well, as far as I'm aware, Apple itself doesn't provide any remediation. It requires its subcontractors to do that. And you know, it's a good principle, but the point is that Apple itself is not, as far as I'm aware, at least in certain sectors that we're aware of, actually apportioning funds for that remediation. It's basing its model on that remedy, that its suppliers are themselves very wealthy businesses that make a lot of money from their Apple contracts, and it's their responsibility, it's their problem to deal with it. So therefore, they're the ones that have to incur cost. Now, I'm not there just to single out Apple, but the point is that is a very dominant approach to the issue of remediation of recruitment fees. And that is actually not a sustainable model. You have these businesses not really using their leverage in the way that they could. So I think those are some things to really, for people to think about.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mustafa. And I know the panel this afternoon will be, I mean, that was a huge question to put to one person, but we'll be looking more at the kind of what human rights due diligence in practice looks like around these kind of pricing issues. But thank you for that, Mustafa. Anna, could you tell us, you know, this conversation that we're having about pricing can be quite a sensitive conversation to be having with businesses. You know, businesses are getting more and more comfortable with the idea about talking about human rights due diligence more broadly. But I wondered if you could tell us a little about how you've had those conversations with companies and how open you've found companies to having these discussions around pricing.
Yes. So I think it starts with being very frank. Where when we talk about wage increases, we always mention, well, there's actually in order to ensure sustainable wage increases, you would need social dialogue. Workers need to be part of the process. You would need accountability. But let's be honest, you also need money. In order to raise wages, either money needs to be redistributed or just more money needs to be entered into the supply chain, so to say. And of course, it's an uncomfortable conversation to be had, but we've had several discussions with our member brands about the possible financing strategies, which start like where we outline also the possible efficiencies, for example, within a brand that can be created to to free up budget or to create financial space. We've also addressed some of the myths. So the idea that you can get higher wages to increase productivity in factories. Well, I think it was part of Jason's point in the beginning that actually, even though productivity has increased, wages haven't, which basically means that wages have gone down. Sorry if I misinterpret or and also if we look at productivity gains, you don't get productivity gains without a financial intervention as well. Either you need new machinery, or you need additional training, or you need complete new setups of factories. So the money component is always there. So yeah, we focus on making that explicit and getting brands to also see where they can where they can turn to in order to find the money, come up with the financing strategy. And then in terms of the different customers cooperating in order to have more impact at the factory, this is where we feel that our labor costing methodology comes in, where the different brands are able to take care of contributing for their share of production. And we've had some of our brands show positive results, that they are indeed contributing to higher wages for their part of production, and are also able to really change wages in their production locations.
Great, that's great. And actually, just to add, there's a very helpful, I'm sure you've all read it, but there's a very helpful ETI report, and there's a section, and I can't remember the name of the report, but I'll put it in the chat. There's a section in there on kind of making the business case for looking at pricing through a human rights due diligence lens. I'm going to wrap the discussion up because people need to go and have lunch before the second panel, but I just want to say a huge thank you to the panelists for, oh, actually, sorry, there was one question I previewed for Patricia. Did you want to tackle that one?
Okay. I'll try and do that really, really quickly. Just to say that, yeah, outsourcing, subcontracting, we've talked a lot about apparel, and the question specifically is asking about this sector, but, you know, even there's a lot of outsourcing of a lot of services that a lot of different companies will sort of, outsource: cleaning, facilities management, all of this stuff. So just in terms of low wages in outsourced services, and for those types of workers, it's a major issue, not just in the private sector, but the public sector as well. I do think we need more disclosure around that, because a lot of companies will say, well, we don't have much, you know, abuse or exploitation happening among our directly employed staff. But, you know, really what we're trying to get to is, as the question points out, those workers in the lower tiers of the supply chain. You know, Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, in Australia, you know, there's only so much you can require companies to disclose if it's not required. So until we make certain data points more prescriptive, I don't think we're going to get a lot of companies disclosing certain types of information that are going to make them look bad or raise certain questions. I think Mustafa even said, you know, there are certain things that for obvious reasons companies are not going to want to talk about publicly, but it's exactly the type of information we need. So how do we encourage more transparency? I would say we need sort of policymakers to come in and make these reporting requirements mandatory, and also, you know, have perhaps a regulator in place that's really looking at the disclosure by companies and putting these questions directly to them. But I think as long as these types of laws and disclosure and that sort of thing is discretionary, we're not going to get a lot of the much needed data that we need from companies, ultimately.
Thank you very much for taking that one. So thank you to the panelists for providing such helpful insight into the links between pricing and remuneration. Human rights due diligence on these issues is clearly essential, but also challenging for companies. I think it's really important that we're having these discussions. We've taken a quick look, a whistle-stop tour this morning, of the importance of proactive due diligence on pricing and not just kind of responding reactively to issues that are found in the supply chain. You know, having proactive discussions around pricing discussions. We've talked about the importance of kind of cross-functional involvement within a company. This is not just a discussion for sustainability and human rights experts within a company, but needs to be something that's integrated across different teams. And also the importance of taking a bottom-up approach to costing, and kind of fact-based costing rather than setting prices from the top down. That's a very brief summary of the rich discussion that the panelists have provided this morning. And the panel this afternoon will be looking at some more of the ways in which companies can implement human rights due diligence in pricing and remuneration. But thank you very much to the panelists again, and thank you to everyone else attending and look forward to further discussion this afternoon.